Okay, my name is Nancy Peluso, and I'm from the University of California at Berkeley, and this is a paper that's the third in a series of collaborations between myself and Peter Vandergeest, who is in Manila right now. And our work is on the formation and normalization of political forests. Of all of our papers so far, this one deals most directly with this resurgence theme, and the forests, as the forests of Southeast Asia were destroyed in many ways by the Pacific War, by Japanese occupations, and by various anti-colonial movements. So just to kind of briefly say the history of our papers on the history of forestry in Southeast Asia. One paper was to look at the genealogies of this idea of the political forest and customary rights, the legal dimensions of that. Another paper that we called Empires of Forestry, which was about colonial, national, and global politics of professional forestry. And this particular one is on political violence and political forests. Okay, we all know that war affects forests and forestry. The direct impacts are well known, they're fairly well documented, or they're being documented in new ways, some which are represented in the papers, following papers on this panel. And as Susanna referred to this morning, violence between foresters and forest-based populations, those pyromaniac peasants, has also generated quite a significant literature, also to which many people here have contributed. But the indirect or institutional effects of war and other forms of political violence on forests and forestry are a whole lot less well known and barely documented. And so what we do is we examine the significance of political violence in the construction of forests and scientific or state forestry in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand. And our main argument is that war, insurgency, and counterinsurgency contributed both to the resurgence of forests and to the establishment of political forests as normal components of the modern nation state in much of Southeast Asia between the 1950s and the 1970s. Forest-based violence also contributed to state ideas of which forests to maintain and which to sacrifice for conversion to agriculture. And in the course of this, scientific forestry or state forestry, as well as forests, were remade in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand through their associations with the various emergencies and insurgencies of this period. These emergencies and insurgencies were staged from areas then represented as jungles by both insurgent groups and by the ruling states and their international allies implementing counterinsurgency activities. Okay, I'm not going to go into great detail here, but of course there are a number of alternative arguments and situations brought up when we talk about scientific or state forestry and the histories of their relations to people and nature. Probably the most common are those that are related to the rationalization of forest management, the bureaucratization of everything, and the influence of colonial forestry, and of course the non-state spaces arguments that Jim Scott has made. These have of course been important in Southeast Asia, but we argue that you simply cannot explain the spread and power, the current power of forestry and conservation, in fact, in Southeast Asian countries without recognizing the importance of these emergencies and insurgencies during the 1950s to 1970s, a period we tend to associate here with the Cold War. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, it's not just the impact of war on the physical resources or the impact of forest or villager violence that we discuss. The types of political forest that we examine was not just resistance to the imposition of forestry, but a kind of violence that represented what we call alternative civilizing projects. In these, jungle-based insurgents differed in their goals for nationhood from the dominant urban-based states that came to rule in the aftermath of World War II. And the violence associated with these jungles, and during this period they were always called jungles, served as a justification for state appropriation of these lands and the transformation of property rights, landscape practices, and the locations of people and settlements to them. You see, the insurgencies that we take as our cases are listed here all of them except for the DITII, which was Islamist rebellions in Indonesia, in West Java, Sumatra, and Sulawesi. All the other ones were communist related, and between the Islamist and the communist ones, in fact, there were a lot of similarities, but not exactly the same. For example, they were similar in that they were also representative of alternative civilizing projects that were launched from forests and jungles. They were different in that for some of the time the U.S. and others supported the Islamist rebellions against the central government, and they never did that with the communist states. Okay. Communists and insurgents and others in Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand used the Maoist strategy of letting the countryside surround the cities, or what we have called elsewhere the angst about forests and jungles surrounding the city. This was meant to engage the support of peasants and other rural subjects. But in fact, the key actors here were not the forest-based peasants. They were the students, the organizers, the party members, and the combatants who went down to the countryside or into the jungles intending to start insurgencies or to stage insurgencies. And there were a number of ideas that were specifically adapted on the mainland. The countryside and the mountains, as you know, would have been Swidden agroforests or jungles. They were also ideal sites for the staging or the launching of insurgencies because they often had other characteristics of what were called the desired conditions of base camps. In fact, there was a book that was written in about 1967 that laid out this Maoist strategy of what makes a good base camp, and that included things like previous revolutionary activities taking place, which in this case were colonial or anti-colonial struggles, being near military targets, terrain providing cover, and the potential for economic self-sufficiency. In other words, the self-sufficiency of the troops and the guerrillas who were being fed and sheltered and hidden by local people. Okay. So these strategies were applied explicitly by the Communist Party of Thailand, the Communist Party of Malaya, and in those countries, communism, of course, was not legal at that time, but in Indonesia, it was. So the Communist Party was a legal party from the time that Indonesia was formed up until 1966 when Suharto took over and criminalized the party and all the leftist associations, all the leftist organizations that were associated with it. And one of the little interesting factoids about these ideas of forest guerrilla welfare or warfare is that a very famous Indonesian general, Nasution, actually wrote a book about principles of guerrilla warfare, and all of these this was also inspired by these Maoist strategies. Okay, so how do political violence and political forestry articulate? Well, there are three ways that through counterinsurgency struggles, or insurgency and counterinsurgency, political forestry is articulated. First is what we call taking the forest out of the jungle. Okay, reorganizing spatial practice and discourses to separate forests from agriculture even further than had been achieved using colonial forest practices. And what this meant was finding additional ways to end Swidden agriculture and the whole set of social relations around Swidden agriculture in these mountainous and border regions. Okay. The second thing is racialization and the movement of people into and out of the forest. This had to do with resettlement, it had to do with evictions, and these were all wrapped up with the politicization of ethnicity and assessments of national belonging. So what you had was a racialization of territorial politics. Third was the transferring of technologies of counterinsurgency and surveillance. As you know, military technologies, which were themselves often an upgrading of things that were already used for foreign surveillance, such as photogrammetry. But of course, the military had massive resources that forestry departments simply did not have in those days for mapping of vast strategic areas, for road building into the forest, and for providing large-scale surveillance equipment such as helicopters and so on that in fact in Indonesia were used for logging as well as for surveillance in later years. So what we have is that the making of the forest, or its resurgence, was in fact violently intertwined with state making in terms of both forest territories, which we call political forests, and the making of racialized and politicized subjects. And I'm going to go into each of these three tendencies in a little bit greater detail in the next part of my talk. Okay. Is this thing not working? Okay. Okay. So, before you could take the forest out of the jungle, you had to create the jungle as a wild place that was peopled by wild people. And of course, I'm sure you all have many images in your mind and ideas about what was going on during the Indo-Chinese Wars and the other kinds of violence that were going on in Southeast Asia and other parts of the world. Governments and insurgents operating in ways that were that created this space as a very dangerous space. Now, insurgents, in fact, saw themselves as alternatively oriented nationalists. Okay? They had different visions for what they wanted to happen in the nation state, but they were characterized as recalcitrant subjects, again, as kind of wild people living in wild, uncontrolled places. And what these representations did was they lent legitimacy to state projects to control these regions and the people who were associated with them. Now, the desires of the military to move people out of those jungles articulated quite well with environmental desires at this important conjunctural moment. Local people in the areas occupied by insurgents were demonized. They were made suspicious as well, and they were also made more dependent or tied more strongly to central states through various forms of violent displacement or through incorporation into agricultural development schemes or programs, as well as through outright threats. And the state's political goals, in some cases, thus coincided with those of political forestry, to transform jungles from peopled, untamed, dangerous entities into more orderly, spatially differentiated and managed forests and agricultural areas with people located neatly in villages next to them. Okay, that was the goal. Of course, it was not completely realized in that way, but what we found in comparing Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand was that in some places it wasn't only political forestry that was that moved forward or that expanded itself, but in some places it was definitely in the interest of the government to expand agricultural production at the expense of the forest. Okay. Counterinsurgency literally meant thwarting insurgents' attempts to incorporate rural people into their alternative state visions by cutting the links between them, okay? Mostly cutting off food as well as physical access to prevent political education, empathetic support, and even recruitment. But we found that counterinsurgency operations moved people in at least 3 different ways into and out of these jungles, articulating again with the purposes of political forestry and each with their own effects on the territorial extent of political forestry. Now, key to these movements were the government's own constructions of the loyalties of their various racialized subjects. Therefore, some residents were forced out of jungles when they were suspected of supporting insurgents. In some cases, jungle settlements or forest-based settlements were consolidated, including the creation of what became known as strategic hamlets. And you also had the movement of people into conflicted jungle zones through resettlement, colonization, or transmigration schemes. And remember, one of the things that we need to remember about this is that the Cold War takes place in Southeast Asia not long after many of these areas became nation states, okay? Just a few years or a couple of decades. And many of these processes that started to take place have to do with that fact. Who is it that is a minority on a national scale and who is a majority on a national scale changed when you started having the national scale. Okay, so it has as much to do with the ways that the geographic or political area under consideration is constructed. Okay, so for example, you had the construction of tribal and migrant, generally Chinese in this case, groups as national minorities, and they were also constructed as migrants, no matter how long they had lived in these particular areas. Secondly, you had the construction of lowland groups as national majorities, okay, and that did something to the way that they were also perceived and moved around in relation to these forests. Third, you had this politicization of ethnicity, where minorities now became suspect. But you have this contradiction happening because the jungle knowledge of tribal peoples, this local indigenous knowledge, knowing the terrain of the forest, was useful to both insurgents that were moving into the forest and those military troops who were going to be involved with the counterinsurgency operations. Okay, let me give you a few examples of this, and then I'm going to close up. During his fieldwork in the northeastern state of Kedah in Malaysia, Peter found upper watershed hamlets that had been moved to lowland sites during the early 1950s. And these hamlets included people who were classified as Malay, meaning they were Malay-speaking and Islamic. They were also classified as Siamese, so they were Buddhist and Siamese-speaking, and they were classified as Sam-Sam, which was Siamese-speaking and Islamic. Okay, this is in Malaya. Now, where the emptied upland areas were not already gazetted as forest reserves, resettlement of these people out of these watersheds would be accompanied by forest reservation. And so on the one hand, these activities consolidated the territorial control of the Forestry Department. Okay. Now, in this case, racial classification did not really affect whether or not people were moved, but it did organize the resettlement process so that ethnic Siamese were contained in fenced camps, and Malays were provided with new villages and new land for growing rice and rubber. And then finally, in a very clear example of the making of ethnicity and the racialization of this landscape, Sam-Sam, those guys that spoke Siamese but they were Islamic, okay, were absorbed into the Malay category when they were moved, and they were made into Malays through the agricultural practices that they were allowed to continue and through their locations within the new rural landscapes. Now, after the height of the emergency had passed, camps containing Siamese and Malaya were taken down, and people were able to establish rubber smallholdings on state lands like Malays who had been resettled. But unlike the Malays, most Siamese never received formal land titles, so that their marginal positions were maintained not through violence or coercive movement at this point, but through exclusion from access to the resources of the state, in this case, the recognition of their land holdings through titles. And another story that comes out of Peter's research that's quite dear to my heart is that older people in these villages adjacent to the reserve forests in Kedah said that displaced villagers continued for decades to travel seasonally to their old village sites to harvest fruit, especially durian from multi-generational trees. And these visits only stopped when the fruit trees were submerged by reservoirs that were being created by the new dams that went into these areas, or claimed by ecotourist resorts located on the shores of the reservoirs. And today, what's interesting is that those likely would be represented as pristine or conservation forests. Okay, a more widely known example was the resettlement of 500,000 Chinese forest squatters into camps called New Villages during the emergency in Malaya and also in Sarawak. While fieldwork and other sources have shown that the Communist Party of Malaya was in fact supported by a variety of peoples, it was represented and racialized as a Chinese organization. The link to forestry science in this case can be seen in the way that the Forestry Department developed new silviculture models specifically for land where forest had been cleared for swidden. So this Malayan uniform system had in fact been initially developed as a technique for regenerating forests that had been cut during the Japanese occupation. But the emergency in the next decade allowed the Forest Department to promote that technique as a rationale for expelling the mainly Chinese cultivators who had occupied villages in forest areas during the emergency, and who were suspected of supporting the Malayan Communist Party insurgents. And my third example is similarly in West Kalimantan, which is in Indonesian Borneo. Rural Chinese were forced to move either to resettlement areas or to become refugees in urban areas. And in Kalimantan, the Indonesian state forcefully engaged tribespeople and various other locals and non-Chinese migrants to these areas against these communists, also glossed in Kalimantan as Chinese, although people of all identities were in fact members or associates of the Communist Party of Indonesia. That same year that the mass violence ended up evicting 50 to 100,000 rural Chinese communists and communist supporters, 1967 was also the year that the very first national forest law was established, which created the very first national forest in Indonesia. And national minorities now had very different relations to these national forests. Lines on maps were drawn to allocate forest concessions in West Kalimantan and elsewhere, and military branches received the concessions along contested borders, in particular along this wide swath of territory between West Kalimantan and the Malaysian state of Sarawak, which is something like 1,000 kilometers long. I'm sure some of you have recently seen some of these articles on oil palm in West Kalimantan and between. It's that border that used to be entirely taken up by military concessions, okay? So there's this whole kind of conflating of national security and forest security in this particular period that precedes that thing about oil palm. Okay, and of course, just very quickly, you had also the consolidated settlement of hill tribes and backward tribes. This was something that happened in all kinds of places, all three of the places that we're talking about. But over the long term, these village consolidations often failed, okay? For example, Orang Asli sites in Malaysia were abandoned, and everywhere people kind of wandered back out into these forest areas to make new Swidens in Kalimantan and Thailand. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting to turn this crazy thing. Okay. Am I there? Where am I? Okay. Okay. Last example, planned and spontaneous settlements into forests. You're all familiar with, of course, transmigration of Javanese, Balinese, and Sundanese trusted groups at this point in Indonesian history. Many of them moved to West Kalimantan in the early years. Unbeknownst to them, and actually very little advertised, was the fact that the land that they were given in these areas had been abandoned by the exodus of 100,000 Chinese from the rural areas. Okay, and so out of those so-called jungles, which were really rural areas, hundreds of thousands of hectares had been left behind, if not claimed or allocated to locals. In Thailand, the effects of agricultural redevelopment were also massive. Millions of migrant farmers were encouraged to occupy reserve forests, especially in the northeast, and significantly, this had very different effects on the longevity and extent of political forests. Finally, I mentioned very briefly earlier this idea of military resources and the idea that military and counterinsurgency budgets dwarf those of forestry departments, and so there was the transfer of technology, maps, and so on. So, in conclusion, okay. The articulation of counterinsurgency development and violence, state building, and the production of state forests and forestry. There's a number of different effects of political violence on forestry. One is that jungles as agrarian environments, which I mentioned earlier in my comment, were re-territorialized. They were violently separated forests from agriculture. Second is that agrarian environments were re-racialized with movements of people out of and into these areas. And third, and most important, is that you cannot understand forest resurgence in Southeast Asia without understanding the history of forest violence. You cannot really understand it without understanding what went on during the Cold War, how forests were used by various contenders within those within those struggles and so on. And one more thing. Jungle discourses of insurgency largely disappeared, okay? They were designated as agriculture or forest, so now you hear about these things as forest-based struggles, except in cases where these forest-based insurgencies and challenges to the state are still going on. So notably, you still have jungles in places like Mindanao in the Philippines, certain places in Burma, and also in West Papua and Aceh, and places where this kind of political violence is still going on. Thank you.
Okay, questions? Well, we'll never think of
Sleeping,
these.
I'm sure, by now.
No, everybody's awake. Everybody's awake. Why don't you line up on that? You can divide amongst yourselves. You can organize yourself. Self-organizing.
Nancy, I guess I just don't understand the last connection between the political violence and the forest resurgence. I mean, it's still sort of opaque in my mind.
Yeah, sorry. Couldn't get it all into the talk. What happens after 1967 with the establishment of a national forest is now you have something on which to collect national forest statistics. Okay, so not only do they have this thing of forest cover, but you have many more political forests. Okay, and what happens is that you've moved all these people out of these areas, or move people into areas, and forest, in fact, is increasing. Because, I'm sorry, it looks like there's a whole lot more forest than there actually is. I don't think that was clear, but.
There's a parallel which I think would be of interest to you, which is in the Lushai Hills in northeastern India, now the state of Mizoram. It's a very important bamboo famine in 57, where relief breaks down. And this eventually results in an insurgency in the late 60s. It goes on for about 20 years, the Mizo National Front. Now, the interesting thing, which I think the parallel, and you've theorized it beautifully, and there's very good work on this, but nobody's conceptualized it, is that 80% of the population of Mizoram, it's about 500,000 people, not large by Indian standards, are relocated in strategic hamlets. And it's explicitly modeled on Malaya. And this is in, as I said, the late 60s. And this breaks down completely the shifting cultivation cycles. And there's a peace accord signed in 87, but obviously things don't go back to where they were. So my question actually is, what happens when the insurgencies die down? Do things at all go back to the way they were? Because that's not the case over here. And I think the Malay case is obviously very important. It's studied a lot and seen as a case study for other states outside of Southeast Asia, neighboring states to follow.
What do you mean, did they go back the way they were?
You know, it's interesting. The strategic hamlets are dismantled. Some people trickle back, but the older systems don't get reconstituted.
No, that's actually
they are
the case.
More or less comprehensively broken, though probably that was not the main target. The target was something else.
Right. Well, and the fact is that in Malaya, they did move people out of those areas. And like I said, the Malays got new land, so they kind of created new villages for them. Other people, of course, there's varied evidence, and some people did wander back in and so on, but institutionally, they did not go back to the way they were. And in fact, Tom, let me go back to your question. Our main argument here is that if you're thinking about what is it that helps constitute political forests, okay, you have to understand not only legal things, not only post-colonial and colonial influences, and the rise of the FAO and all these kind of large-scale institutional things, but you also have to think about, in Southeast Asia at least, political violence actually became the justification to transfer the control of those areas to a major national institution, okay? Prior to this, in West Kalimantan at least, there was no national forest. There wasn't a political forest. Political forest really starts in West Kalimantan in the 60s. I mean, you've got a few things here and there. You've got a concession here and a concession there. But under colonialism, as well as in the early years of independence, forests were kind of under the governor or under the colonial officer, they were already decentralized. So to understand political forestry and then in that sense the forest resurgence. Okay? Sorry.
Okay.
It seems as though a lot of what we're all talking about is, what you define as forest, what you don't define as forest, and that gets us into intricacies of language as well. And in your presentation, you make the distinction between jungle and forest. How does that work in Thai or Bahasa? There is not in China. In Chinese, it's basically the same word. So how does this work linguistically? I mean, it seems to work as a distinction when we're talking about it. Maybe it works maybe in the case of Mizoram and India, but how does it work in Thai or in Bahasa? Is there a distinction?
In Indonesian, you would indicate it through kind of rimba, which can be also very big forest or jungle or untouched or whatever. It means big forest, right? And hutan. And people differentiate it in various ways. I would have to pull out right now, actually, the army documents and things like that are written in Indonesian to be able to tell you in what contexts you would see these different terms. And in fact, if you're looking at it through, it's easier to make this argument through the English literature, obviously, because there are two very different things. And for example, in the local language where in West Kalimantan where I was working, there are different words for these different kinds of things. Hutan is very much a government forest, and the word for forestry in Indonesian is kehutanan. And so that, they've got do'oputod in that place, but they don't usually call it hutan unless it's being organized by the government. So in some cases, it's actually really, really slight, and I could never give you any idea what that would be in Thai. But conceptually, when you think about, and Candace Slater has written on this, other people have written on this, the idea of jungles is really another way of putting it when the government is not controlling what's going on. Michael Dove's written that article on jungle in Pakistan and how, in fact, it sounds a whole lot like fallow forests, So there's all that kind of thing. And in fact, all these guys that write memoirs out of the Malayan Emergency and the Sarawak Emergency and the various things that were going on in the Borneo Wars, confrontation, they always use the word jungle, okay? And so a lot of it depends on who's using the word in which contexts, and it is just easier to make that argument in English. In a similar way, the word for peasant and farmer are the same thing in Indonesian, but activists make a difference in what their English translation of that word is, depending on their political perspective.
One more question, and if there is one? Okay, let's go on to Emmanuel.